Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. We are going to be talking on a very important subject in South Africa at this moment in time, being in a COVID lockdown situation and having seen a lot of media in terms of policing within South Africa in relation to regulations and in relation to crime in the country. The presenter today is Dr. Chris de Kock. Many of you will have heard his presentations that we have done previously. Chris often is on the radio, so you will have probably heard him quite frequently talking about the latest crime statistics. But today, he's going to be talking about two critical things. The first one being the effectiveness of policing during COVID-19 and lockdowns in South Africa. And Chris will also be presenting some of the latest crime statistics and the implications for policing in South Africa. So just a little bit about Chris. Many of you will know who he is. He is the former head of the Crime Information Analysis Center of the South African Police Service. He also holds a PhD in sociology. And over many years, not only in terms of his time at the Human Sciences Research Council and being a member of the South African Police Service, but post that period, he's done extensive amounts of research and has extensive amounts of experience in looking at crime statistics and also looking at other issues relating to that, such as policing. And many of you will have heard Chris on the radio stations commenting on crime statistics on a fairly regular basis. So as an associate of ours, he works with us on a number of different projects, from looking at crime situation in particular police precincts to working with us on our web mapping portals. So I'm going to now hand over to Chris, and he's going to talk to us about policing and COVID-19 in South Africa.
Good morning. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the role of a police service or force anywhere in the world, because we all know that the essence of policing is prevention of crime by the application of the law. And then where prevention fails, detection kicks in. So there's cases, the world is not a perfect place, so you will find that prevention does not always work, and detection will then kick in. They must find the culprits and hand them over to the courts for further action. And then the police service must also see that there's public order, that we don't have riots, and if we have riots, they must control it in the correct manner. So that is actually the essence of policing. In some countries, they will have a special police service or special police force to control public order, not the same one that will do the prevention and detection of crime. Now, we have a state of disaster since about a year ago, the end of March last year. We have a state of disaster. It's not a state of emergency. It's a little bit less serious than a state of emergency, where the state have much more powers. But the government, and in our case, committee that look after the state of the disaster, the Command Council, will issue regulations, and those are also laws, and the police should see that people abide to these laws. Okay, now we have seen many examples in the media where policing went wrong, where actually they were applying the regulations, but they didn't use any discretion. There's some outstanding examples. There may be many more. For example, in the recent times, there was the case of a person who had to go in the middle of the night, a father who had to go in the middle of the night to fetch some milk at the emergency pharmacy for his newborn baby. And he was stopped because it was after the curfew. I think it was about 1 o'clock at night. And he was stopped. And the police didn't use any discretion there. And even the minister admitted it after the time. They arrested this guy. The mother and this child of a few days old had to walk to the car a few blocks from there to go and fetch the milk. I don't know if she also fetched the car. And he was then taken to the police station. Now, that case is clearly the police didn't use their discretion. They should have handled it in a total different way. But this is now the example which we see on TV, we hear on the news and in the media and the social media, and it becomes quite a big issue. Then we had those people who were standing in a row to get their grants, and a water cannon was used to disperse them. Now, that one was also a very bad example It was actually a total mess in the sense that the police didn't use their discretion, and also they didn't even use the rules of crowd control. I mean, if you do crowd control, you must read the crowd. And in that case, they could have just told the people that they must distance themselves, there must be social distance between them, that they cannot stand on top of each other, and that they should wear their masks at all times. And that would have solved that whole problem, and not use a water cannon. And then we have other cases. The latest actually be last Friday, when the crowd was assembling outside the court in Bloemfontein, where Mr. Ace Magashule and some of his co-accused were appearing. And then this crowd, there was no social distancing. There was no, in many cases, I've seen the crowd, most people didn't wear masks. In any case, they didn't have any permission for this big crowd to gather outside the court. Now, in that case, I think the police handled it 100%. Because if in that case they would have used crowd control capacity, the water cannon, if they wanted to break up that crowd, it could have caused a lot of violence and in the end up in something of a second Marikana. So in my view, my knowledge of crowd control, I have quite a bit of knowledge of that, you should leave the crowd, even if it's illegal, even if they don't behave how they should behave. You have to read the crowd and you have to look at the crowd, the commander on the scene, to really handle it. If people from the top comes in and say, no, we don't want the crowd there, it will be the very same situation that we had at Marikana, because that is exactly what happened at Marikana. So I think we see certain examples on the media, or in the media and in the social media, and we then sort of say this is what is happening everywhere. I personally think that up to now, with the exception of these cases that I've mentioned and others that I don't know of, the police did quite a good job in policing the COVID-19 regulations. Unfortunately, different from crime, we don't have figures. From time to time, figures are released, like on the 26th of January, for example, Eyewitness News, but also a lot of other media released figures that for a certain period, 7,270 people were arrested in KZN for flouting the regulations. And those 7,270, 5,228 did not wear masks. So this piece of information tells us, well, the police are doing something to apply the regulations that regulate the wearing of masks, the social distancing issue, and the movement of people. Say, for example, if there was a regulation that you can't go onto the beach, well, that were then applied. We don't know how well they applied, and if they applied on an even basis right through the country, and that in every place that people abide to these rules because the police are there. I must be honest, I mostly now move only in 2 precincts. I can't take my car and go and drive through the country and see what is happening everywhere. But in the 2 precincts that I move in, which is mostly Garsfontein and Brooklyn, and then sometimes I go to Joburg, and there I move in the northern areas of Joburg. In all of those areas, it seems people are wearing their masks. I go to restaurants quite regularly, and it seems people wear their masks. But then when they meet each other, they take their masks off. Now, the police can't be everywhere. It is actually our job to tell people you should not do that. It's actually the restaurateur's job or the bar owner's job to say, listen, wear your mask, sit down, and then you can take your mask off and drink and eat as much as you like. But it seems in the 2 areas where I move, the people are abiding in this. But the fact is, I don't think it is because they are afraid of the police. And I basically haven't seen any police in these 2 precincts in the last year. The only time that I see them, I went to the Garsfontein police station in connection with my firearm, and there I saw many police officers. But in In my area, I usually don't see police. And when you see a police bucket passing through, a police vehicle, it is mostly because I live along a route where police officers from Mpumalanga who's visiting us at Pretoria, they will move on that route. So it's a bakkie which is here or a vehicle which is here to come and fetch maybe documentation or whatever the case may be. I think the reason why people wear their mask and so on is clearly because they fear, especially now in the second wave. People, I think, have starting to realize that we have to abide, we have to wear masks, we have to keep the distance, because more and more people die that you know. In the first round, it was a bit far away. But in the second round now, the second wave, we know of much more people that you knew somewhere in the past and they died, or it's family members, and also family members get sick, and then you know that this is dangerous and you have to abide. Okay, now COVID situation places South Africa and everywhere in the world in an experimental situation. It actually places us in a situation where we can look at crime figures to see what is the effect of all of these things that is happening. The alcohol ban, the fact that people can't move around, the fact that in the beginning people couldn't go to work, restaurants were closed, businesses which were usually open in the evening when crime occurred were closed, and there was a curfew. So all of these things actually had an influence on crime. But some of the interpretations that we hear and that we heard right at the beginning, especially from our Minister of Police, right at the beginning, a few weeks after the first lockdown, he released figures very regularly, which I'm very glad that he did, as I'm glad that I'm now releasing these quarterly statistics. But his interpretation were quite simplistic. And now we have banned alcohol in this first lockdown, and that is why crime virtually disappeared, especially certain crimes like murder, attempted murder, and rape. Well, it's true. In April, in the first lockdown, there was a decrease in murder with 55.5%. It doesn't mean that murder disappeared. It just half of the murders disappeared, even in that first lockdown. Now, you'll remember in that first weeks, the first 3 weeks, but even went on in the fourth and the fifth week, basically the whole of April and even up to May, you virtually didn't see cars moving around. It was like a ghost city. If you go to pharmacy, you go to the shop for essentials, you find that you're basically alone on the road. Now, in that circumstances, even the criminals were locked in the house. It was like every one of us were under house arrest. And that had the effect that on murder, and murder is our most reliable figure, all the other figures can be questioned sometimes. But murder, we had a 55.5% decrease in April. But if we take murder, and you can look at attempted murder at the same time, it's just here, it went down by 55.5. It then went in May with 44.1, decrease of 41. Then in June, the decrease became smaller, 11.8. Then in July, maybe it is as a result of the alcohol ban that we found in July, and that then brought us down 21.2%, but not the same as there with the 55.5. And then in August, people got used to this whole thing again, and business as usual, and we have only a 6.9% decrease. Then in September, from September right through to December, we get fluctuations, but it is all increases. And actually, if one look at this last quarter, there was a total increase of 6.7%. So it actually showed that people were locked down, they were disorientated, the criminals especially, and didn't know what to do. And then people go back to work. Maybe they didn't work as late as previously because we have curfews actually the whole time, although the curfew fluctuate. But we are basically back at normal when it comes to our crime. And I believe in the next quarter, which will be January to March, we are now basically in the middle of that, the increases will even go higher. The same applies to attempted murder, exactly the same picture. When we come to robbery aggravated, which I'm still analyzing that because I have to go to something like which is called street robbery, public robbery. And according to my analysis, because the biggest chunk of robbery aggravated is the aggregated category of public street robbery, which is usually the biggest chunk, about 60% of all your robbery aggravates. And then you have carjacking, business robbery, and house robbery, which is the trio crimes. And you have small bits of truck jacking and robbery of cash in transit. They are very small proportions. But the biggest proportion is street robbery. Now, what we see here is also that very significant decrease in April, May. Then it becomes smaller all the way. And in December, we only had a 7.4% decrease. But you must remember, we still have a curfew. And these street robberies usually happen on workers. The target is usually workers on their way to work, or especially on their way from work to their residence at night, because they have to use public transport, trains and taxis, especially at that time of the night, and buses, but mostly taxis. And that taxi doesn't drop them at their home. The taxi drops them a kilometer away because they live in an informal settlement. And that is when they get robbed, because especially on paydays, which may be the end of the week or the end of the month. And that haven't normalized yet, because we still have a curfew. Even now, restaurant workers have to leave, but all of these social places, the workers have to leave at 10 o'clock to be at home at 11 o'clock. So that actually, I think, still keep this going down, but not at the rate in the beginning of the lockdown. I'm not going to spend too much time here, although, again, the same thing that you find at murder, attempted murder, you'll find also on rape, minus 56.9, 47 in the first 2 months, and then it goes down, and it starts to lift up again here in November, December. Now, again, the minister right at the beginning said, ladies drink too much, then they go home, and on their way home, they get raped. Now, I think that's a very dangerous and a very simplistic view of how this crime occurs, because many people work late, and they have to use public transport to go home, and that is when they get raped along the way. We can look at the place of rape. We'll see it's public places. It is usually streets and buildings and so on, veld and so on. So again, because of the fact that we still have a curfew, which I think a little bit they can go home a little bit earlier, but still it is increasing with small proportions already. The same applied to assault. So partly these crimes, especially rape, assault, GBH, and assault common, we see the same trends. And it can be a little bit at the beginning, in April, May. It may be that the alcohol clampdown had a small effect. It at least keep our figures for the emergency rooms in hospitals, the ICUs, and so it kept more beds open there because we had less stabbings, less gunshots, less of those, because people were drinking at home or they were more sober. That is true. But it doesn't cure it over the long term. I mean, if we can have a permanent alcohol ban, if we can get rid of alcohol, it will not cure the situation. It will not change the situation, because people will just get other sources of alcohol and other and drugs and so forth. So organized crime will take over that role, and we will still struggle with these alcohol-related violence and so forth. When it comes to more organized types of crime, and I don't have, for example, CIT robberies there, I felt the figures are a little bit low. And it seems that, for example, a very organized crime like cash in transit robberies, which is, I think, in South Africa, robberies of cash in transit and then also truck hijackings are the most organized violent crime that you can get. I mean, a cash in transit, the robbery is not just a robbery by chance, somebody walking down the street and they rob somebody. This is really planned. And the same applies to truck jackings. Now, both of those have skyrocketed in the last quarter. But if you look at the truck jackings and robberies of cash in transit, virtually disappeared in the first quarter, April, May, and June. It's not in the table there, but I can tell you it virtually disappeared. Then it came back in July, August to September. And then it came back with vengeance in October, November, December. It's as if these organized criminals are now really back on the job, and they have to claim back what they have lost in April, May, and June. Now, contacting very much the same picture. For minus 70 to 71.2, it virtually disappeared in April, although there were still carjackings. But then it went down, 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 and now it's on the up again. And back to normal, basically, if we can call it that. House robbery, not the same specifically, but basically a same trend. Very strange, and this is something that one will have to find out. In September, there was a 22.3% increase in house robberies. And interesting that the active form report on farm attacks, which was released a few days ago, actually also showed that most of the farm attacks not happened in September, but in August, which show that there's something that happened there which really gave us quite significant increases. Okay, then business robbery, it's actually the whole time on the decrease, but it started off with a 48 decrease to an 8% decrease. I mean, that's also the same trend that we find. Now, one would ask, where is the burglary residential? Because that's our biggest category of crime. But unfortunately, the police didn't release. They've released 3 briefing documents together with the tables. You see, this data, you won't find any of this data in these tables. You won't find in the tables of stations, the tables, the quarterly station tables, provincial tables, and national table, which you find on the website. You will find it under a different item there, which is the briefing documents. And it's only in the briefing document where they broke it down to monthly, which I think it's wonderful. And I hope they continue with that and they don't stop it, because I think this is actually very good, because this tells us a story. But the burglary business was the only one that they published in all 3. On the burglary residential, they did it only on the last 2 quarters, and so theft of motor vehicle and theft out of motor vehicle. But if we look at this one, it has a very strange tendency. You have a 24.8 increase in April, when we saw no cars move around, when there was a very strict curfew, a very early curfew, when we had the alcohol ban, when we had all of those things, but like that. We had in April, we had this massive increase actually in burglary business. Now, this was especially schools. It was schools, it was the informal traders, especially sometimes foreign traders, with their spaza shops in the township. They became the victim in April because people were hungry, people didn't have money, people were locked down. So you can still slip after curfew, slip down the road, or even in broad daylight, slip down the road and go and break into a shabib, which is now locked up, or a spaza shop, and especially a school. It seems to me that there are no guards in the school because the schools were basically abandoned. And a lot of this is school break-ins. Okay, stock theft, you see that actually all over, it just stayed on small decreases, but there was no significant trend. It's sort of a flat line there. And then common robbery, you will see also the same as have you seen in the slides, and if I had included it here, the same as street robbery. The curfew predicted that people go home too late after they worked, and they then, especially here in the beginning, it was a 68% decrease, but then later on it became smaller, but still there's a curfew even today, and people go home earlier, and I think that helped, and go sort of at one time, and that is now protecting them against common robberies and street robberies. I may just say again here, working for the alcohol industry, although it's a massive industry which creates thousands and thousands of jobs and so on, but I'm not working for them at all. I don't get any money from them. But it's not the one solution to South Africa's crime problem. I think the trends are very clear that it is not the wonder solution. What we will do is we will actually create and open up a market for organized crime. The same that happened in the United States in the 20s and 30s. I'm not an expert on the virus and the current pandemic and so on, but what I know is what I listen to people, and I think we have got a few quite highly qualified experts. And the other day, for example, there was an interview between Professor Mari and Carl Blanche 2 weeks ago. And the professor said, this virus will forever exist and it won't disappear in his lifetime. So in my lifetime, the virus is not going to disappear. We're going to get injections. The virus is going to mutate, but we will live with masks and live with all of these distancing and all of these things. Lockdowns from time to time. We may live with that for quite a few years to come. And that places a burden on policing and on police resources. If they didn't have that, they could spend that time, that money on the fighting of crime. And now they don't focus on their primary prevention and detection functions. So that will have an effect on our policing. And I'm just shocked by some of the figures of this last quarter of last year, October to December, because it seems if that is going to be our new normal for crime during COVID and even after COVID, we're going to see much more crime. And I think we already have too high levels of violent crime, especially. So I think that is what is going to happen. Then also there's other factors. Together with the COVID, you must also remember, and I haven't even listed it there, that COVID have killed some of our police officers and some very experienced police officers in the process. And it's still going to kill some of them. Even if they get the injection, the chances are still there if there's a new mutation and things like that. Also, unemployment. I mean, our levels of unemployment have just skyrocketed. In the release of prisoners, although it's not the most serious prisoners or the most violent of prisoners, but prisoners were released. And unfortunately, we don't have a very good record of rehabilitation of prisoners. So they go to jail as maybe a petty criminal, a smaller criminal, but in jail they learn a few tricks, and they may come out and they may still not find work, especially where we have high levels of unemployment, and they may revert back to crime, and this time more serious crime. And then we have constant court disruptions. I must also add to the constant court disruption, we don't know about it because it's not mentioned every day and we don't get figures on that. But the other day when I visited Garsfontein stations, people were talking there and they said, no, they went to this police station and it was closed because somebody got COVID. Then they went to another police station. That police station was closed for 3 days because of COVID. So you get court disruptions, but you also get disruption of police stations. And all of this boils down to less prevention. And we also in South Africa, unfortunately, especially since 2012, I would say, we basically don't do much prevention. We don't do much prevention. Our police doesn't have a record. And that is why our figures are constantly increasing since 2012. What I've also seen, and we see more and more in the media, and the President has even mentioned this in his speech, that we find that organized crime has become much more prominent in 2020. I, for example, didn't realize that we had such a gang culture also in certain areas in Durban or eThekwini. I didn't realize that until we had very recently 2 killings of so-called underworld figures in the Chatsworth area. And I thought it is only in Cape Town and maybe a little bit here in Johannesburg that you find this. But it is there. And all of these things now, I mean, even the gang violence have increased in Cape Town. And lots of murders can be connected to gang violence. But also avocado theft. They now call it the green gold. And it is a very organized theft of avocados. The railway and school infrastructure theft. I mean, we have seen that figure there in April of last year. Illegal gold mining, building site hijacking, transport, heat squad, and cable theft syndicates were there. But because of the economic situation, have become more prominent. And I think we are going to see much more of that because people are unemployed. And at very same people worked in building companies before. And now they will just join those who do the building site hijackings, where they hijack a building site and they demand a certain proportion of the full tender. One of these days, alcohol bans won't even make a difference because growth in illegal producing alcohol and alcohol that will be smuggled into South Africa will just be so prominent that an alcohol ban won't make any difference. So, yeah, I also, it seems to me, if you look at it, that organized crime have become much more violent. Even this avocado theft that I referred to, those gangs there in Tsanin, in that area, Magubas Kloof, in that areas, they are armed and they are prepared to fight the security companies to deploy in these avo plantations. And with that, I think I will stop there so that we have at least a little bit of discussion.
You start off by explaining that the police have not been able to show discretion during these curfews and so forth. They're not reading the crowds. And this seems to have been an issue that we've been facing for quite a while. Having been involved with the police, having been involved with crowd control, understanding that these crowd control rules exist within the police, what should the police be doing in order to improve the ability to, in the one instance, control crowds, but also to regulate COVID? Because as you point out, there is a high likelihood that we will continue to be in a situation of the virus and also lockdowns. What would your recommendations be to the police in terms of how they should be doing this?
Well, when we look at crowd and crowd control, and I was quite a bit, when I was at the Human Science Research Council, involved in that issues. And I was later also the chair of the technical committee on public order policing, just before I joined the police. I just think that there is a lack of training and experience in crowd control. Not only training, because you can send the person on a 3-week or 4-week or 5-week course, and you can train them about the dynamics of crowds and that you have to read crowds and that you have to observe and see that this crowd, it's better not to do any crowd control and that you should use a small little monitor force to monitor the crowd, not put your main force there immediately for the crowd to see, because that will make them more aggressive, and it will actually, rumors will circulate and all of that type of things. So you can train the person in all of that, but that person should also have experience, because through experience they will learn, we have done the following in that situations, and that was the outcome. And there we did the wrong things and the outcome was very ugly. But I mean, one of the best examples is if you look at Marikana. Okay, Marikana, one of the problems was they were actually instructed from a site far away from this, and the commanding officer on the site didn't make the decisions, it seems. Now, that type of thing, people should be trained in that and they should get experience. In the early days of the new dispensation and even during the apartheid years, there were special units doing this crowd control, doing the public order policing. And many countries have got special police that do that kind of thing. Now, a person there get properly trained, They won't get promotion if they are not getting trained. And they must have experience to even get promotion. Now, that is the ideal situation. I don't know if we can afford it, but I think much more should be invested in training of people to read crowds, to understand crowds. And I must say, I've got quite a respect for those officers who handled the Ysmagashule crowd that were outside the court there at Herzog Plain in Bloemfontein. Then on the issue of COVID, I mean, the public order will solve some of the problems. But when it comes to COVID, I think our police should be much more trained in public relations and to train them and to retrain them all the time that they are not there as a suppressor of people. They're not there. It's not in the old days that, you give somebody a club or you hit him over the head and then, you solve the problem there and then. You have to go to a person and you have to have, I've seen something in France one day where two gendarme officers in Lyon on their motorbike on a Saturday afternoon drive down the street, and there's a person with a dog where it wasn't covered, the dog's nose wasn't covered with a thing that the dog can't bite other people. And they just stopped and they look at him and they showed a finger. And I have never seen action so quickly taken by this owner of the dog. But it is because that police have a total authority. You're not afraid of them. They are friendly people, but you know that if you do something and you get over a certain point, they are going to there's going to be action. Okay, can I also just say one thing, because I don't know if there's going to be questions. I must just say, I now since Friday basically non-stop, during normal working hours, looked at the data which now was released for the third time, and I must say I'm quite impressed. I think there's a lot of data, especially in that briefing documents, which can be used to analyze by all of us, and that can also help the police a lot if we then comment on that and make it public as far as possible.
One of the questions coming from Koba was, can we somehow get access to the data that has been shown in the presentation? So what I just think we'll do is that when we put this onto the website, what we will do is give the presentation, and if we can maybe just also provide the document that you're referring to so that people can get access to that documentation at one location.
Yeah, I think we can. Look, the documents is also on the police website, the ones that I've used to draw up these tables. And there's a lot of information there, also about stations and about a lot of things. I mean, the data really talks to somebody. But that is on the briefing documents. So me and you must just talk afterwards how all of these can be combined on one point.
Tembisa, I wanted to ask a question about the policing. In terms of the stats, if the stats have dropped because of maybe alcohol ban, because of the curfews and etc., post-COVID, how do we keep those numbers? I know those numbers are going to start rising again, but how can we stabilize it, if I can put it that way?
The answer there is basically visible policing, visible intelligence-based policing. If you don't have that, and that is why from 2003-04 up to 2012, our crime constantly went down. Our murders were decreasing from when I joined the police in 95, it was about 25,000 murders per annum. And then it actually slowly but surely decreased after certain actions were taken, but then very systematically. And of course, sometimes with big jumps like at the World Cup in 2010, our murder rate went down from that 24,000 right down to 15,000. And then came 2012, and that was as a result of intelligence-focused policing, especially on those parts of, for example, murder, which is highly policeable. We made a distinction between highly policeable and less policeable. And at every management board meeting, those things were discussed, and a focus was on crime. And then in 2012, unfortunately, maybe as a result of new people, and maybe as a result of what happened to these new people 6 weeks after they were appointed at Marikana, that thing just went haywire. It just went up from 2012 to today. We still don't have a grip again on murders or all our violent crime. And that is because we don't do visible policing. Alcohol ban, I don't think it's worth the economic impact. So I don't think that's going to help, and organized crime will just take over. I just think that also curfews, we can't continue with curfews forever. But if we want to continue with something like that, it has to be used to fight crime. At the present moment, there's a curfew, but it seems criminals are even operating during the curfew hours.
Chris, thanks a lot for your presentation. It was very insightful. Good to get a feeling of what's happening with the quarterly crime statistics. Also looking at it from a policing point of view. We will make this video available on our website. And yeah, just again, thanks everybody for participating in the presentation. And we look forward to chatting to you again in a couple of weeks' time.